Welcome to the Working on Wellbeing podcast by the World Wellbeing Movement, the podcast that allows you to be a fly on the wall during conversations with the world's leading wellbeing experts. I'm your host, Sarah Cunningham, and today we'll be exploring the profound role of purpose and meaning in our lives with a leading expert on positive psychology. But first, I'd like to take a moment to thank our series sponsor, S&P Global. The world's leading organisations rely on S&P Global for the essential intelligence they need to make confident decisions. S&P Global, powering global markets. Well, I am delighted to introduce today's guest, Professor Michael F Steger. Now, I first met Michael at the World Happiness Summit, or WHASU. Michael is a renowned psychologist and an expert in the science of meaning. He is also a professor of psychology at Colorado State University, and he's the director of the Center for Meaning and Purpose, as well as the author or co-author of a large number of publications, including Designing Positive Psychology and Purpose and Meaning in the Workplace. Professor Michael Steger, it is so great to meet you.
Thank you, Sarah. I know that we were in the same kind of circulating flow of humanity at WHASU, but thank you for letting me be part of the well-being movement today. I'm really excited to join you.
Oh, well, we're honoured to have you, and I've had the privilege of hearing you speak at the last two WHASUs, and I think your work's really important, so I'm really excited for our listeners to hear from you today. But I always really like to hear your background first, because I'm so interested in how people get involved in working in wellbeing in the area you're in. So you're obviously not just a professor of psychology, but have this deep specialism in the science of meaning and purpose. And I wonder, going right back to your early days, was there any defining moment that sort of led you down this path of study?
Oh, a defining moment? I'm not sure. This is a backstory. I think I've learned that I tend to think in terms of backstories too. So I'm going to try to rein it in a little bit. But the biggest twist, I think, in my story of why I study what I study is that I wasn't really interested in well-being at all, or happiness or anything like that. I was just really interested in how weird it is that we're alive, and that we know this, and there's so much that we can do with this experience, and everyone can choose a different path, and in fact, we ourselves can choose different paths. And how do we make those choices? Like that was kind of the stuff I wrestled with as a kid. I grew up in a rural area, um, you know, felt kind of isolated from the real world, sort of stuff. There's like all the 80s movies set in small towns were basically my life. And, just looking around the town, it just was a marvelous and horrible thing to me that everyone seemed to know what they were doing. Everyone seemed to know like how the universe worked and where everything came from and where everything was going and what right and wrong was and who was a good person, who was a bad person, who had value, who didn't. And I just didn't know how they could figure that out. Like how being in like just one little spot in the world, can anyone feel confident that they know what's really going on, that they know what we're really supposed to do with our lives? Uh, even if you like really live wholly committed to a religious path, there's still a million different details to sort out, right? Even if someone's telling you what you're supposed to do, there's still a lot to figure out. And just that path of figuring things out, that's what I was really attracted to. And in terms of formative moments, I think it was probably around the time I grew up Catholic, and as the oldest son, I thought I had to become a priest. But then I realized my dad wasn't a priest, so he found a loophole. So I found a loophole, and I thought then you have to be a therapist, right? If you don't want to be a priest, you have to be a therapist. So that was the path I pursued. And in some of those therapy sessions, talking with people and realizing that some of the really cool, interesting, philosophical stuff about why are we here? Why do bad things happen to good people? How are we supposed to muddle our way through? Like that stuff really makes a difference in people who've been traumatized, for example. those questions of like, wait, what is the world really like? How is it really put together? What are the rules? Who am I? What is my place? Like those things really made a difference. So that's what I decided I wanted to study, right? How do we wrestle with what we're doing with this really strange gift that we've been given of existence?
So, did you also study philosophy then as well, or go straight into training to be a psychologist?
I mean, I've had a lot of wanderings in my path. I've not never been a particularly great person at getting things done the way that they should be gotten done. I find the more complicated ways to do it. So I had dabbled with pretty much everything. I tried to resist the call to being a helpful person as long as I could. I was like really not that philosophers or any of these other majors I'm going to list, they're all very helpful, but I had one fixed set in my mind of what was helpful based on how I was raised and the values of my family. So I was curious about, I want to be a novelist. I want to be a journalist. I got interested in economics for a little while because it seemed to order the world, you know. I was really deep into particularly East Asian religions for a while. And I thought that would be my major. And philosophy was the major I thought I was going to really sink my teeth into. But that first philosophy class was the writing is so difficult to enjoy for me at least, right? So it was like, oh, what does my career look like if this is what I'm doing? And then I have to talk about it all the time, and then I have to write about it all the time. I was like, this is too hard for me. I have a cousin who's a philosopher, and thank God he exists and other philosophers exist, but it's far too difficult for me. So I chose
Or
this path
does
that
he,
kind of bent
though?
the law.
I mean, I had to throw the philosophical joke in there. Does he exist? Do we exist?
Mm.
we're,
I know,
we're really getting
or we
into
can go
it.
with the conundrum of the time. Is it all just a simulation, right? And this is, which I don't really understand. I never understand that one because who has us in the simulation? Why do they care? Why do they care? Like that they'd want to run a simulation with someone like me. So that's a pretty sad answer. But yeah, the philosophy, like, do we exist? That question is trickier than it's best to laugh that one off because that one, like, do we exist and what about our existence actually exists is a really tricky question, I think, when it comes down to it too. So not to get too serious, but
Well, we're getting really deep, but this is a really, really deep topic or a really deep area. And, let's dive into it because I suppose what's at the heart of your work and your research is the science of meaning, the science of purpose. So, at the risk of making a pun, what does meaning mean? And how does it
yeah,
differ from purpose? Enlighten us.
I kind of wish I'd just been a purpose researcher so I wouldn't have to talk about what the meaning of meaning is, but it's comes with the territory and I'm a grown boy now, so I know what I'm doing. But yeah, so the meaning of meaning turns out to have been one of the trickiest parts, and it's also the one that has the biggest potential to alienate people from the concept of meaning, right? Because if someone like me and I'm characterized as an expert in some ways, if someone like me comes along and says meaning is this and it's that, and I let's say I've got a particular view in my head and it's influenced by philosophy, and then it's like you have to wrestle with everything. You have to be okay with quantum uncertainty, and you have to be okay with you're not ever really knowing yourself. You have to be okay with the inevitability but unpredictability of death, and you have to be okay with suffering, and you have to know, what's going to happen to you after you're dead, and all these sorts of things. You have to resolve all of that, and then your life is meaningful. Or even if I say things that sound like that, it can be really off-putting for people, first of all. But second of all, there's really no evidence that big, you have to have read Hume and Locke, and you have to have like enjoyed Ulysses, like you have to all like do these certain things on a checklist. None of that seems to be true. So that's my giant caveat. Like most people around the world, most of the time are doing pretty darn good with having a meaningful life, whether we bombard them with criteria from Western philosophy or not, right? So I wanted to get that out there that when we start talking about complicated ideas around meaning or any of this sort of stuff, we're just trying to lay out a good, effective way for researching it and building, you know, the kind of knowledge that science excels in, which is ideally the kind of understanding that you can repeat and you can test and you can see the boundary conditions of. So not what it matters in your heart, not what matters in your spirit, but what we can what we can start to share as a common language of talking about a phenomenon that, probably changes from person to person from year to year. So I want your listeners to know that their experience of meaning is right. Whatever it is, their experience of meaning is probably right. And all of the words that we paint around it are just one way of trying to form a language around a global community of people who want to talk about it in a specific way.
Yeah.
So that's the first caveat because, yeah, when you look at the data, you just ask people in a non-threatening way, like, yeah, is your life meaningful? Most people will agree that it is. And now we can wander into the weeds a little bit because I think that kind of gut response of, yeah, my life is meaningful. I think that's one of the three dimensions that researchers are starting to coalesce around and have a lot of consensus about. And I would call that one significance. Like, does your life have significance? And, we're lucky in English that we've stolen little bits of lots of different languages and clumped them together in one in one big stew. So we can use, words from Latin and Germanic and all these and French and all these sorts of things. And significance is in a lot of languages just another synonym for meaning, but we have a sense in English that we can talk about it slightly differently that doesn't exist, for example, in German. So we're very lucky that we're the ones talking on this podcast right now, and it'd be really cool to hear other words for it. But significance, significada in Spanish, is about, is your life worth living? Simple as that. Does your life have inherent value? And I think if people feel that, you can get that at a gut level, and like kids can get that too. So I would even suggest that, like, are you in it? Are you in this game? And is it worth sticking around for? Like, that's maybe the foundation of meaning in life. And it's actually the area of meaning that we study the least. So we don't even know if it's one thing or two things. Like, it could be also the idea of mattering, right? Like, a lot of people are talking about mattering, and research is starting to come out now on that. And because they're both kind of new to the party, they're kind of put together in oh, this is the third dimension of meaning, conversation, but they could be different things as well. So we might have four on our hands pretty soon. So who
So, but
knows,
you
right?
said three dimensions. So, if significance is one of the dimensions, what are the other two?
Yeah, the second one I think is what you're trying to do right now, which is coherence, like trying to make sense of things, right? This is the idea that if life is pure chaos, it can't be meaningful. And if we can never tell what's going to happen next, I don't know if you've ever watched a movie and the director is very, very clever. And so there's twists, and then there's another twist, and then there's another twist, and then there's a twist. And then eventually you get this sense it's not worth investing in anymore,
Mm.
right? The payoff is not going to be very big. It doesn't feel realistic because what feels realistic is, as much as it can be aggravating, the sun rises, the sun sets, or the clouds get darker gray, the clouds get lighter gray, whatever your weather situation is, right? Um, because life is pretty consistent and it's pretty predictable. Sometimes it's like crushingly so, right?
Yeah.
You just have this sense like Groundhog Day phenomena. You're doing the same thing over and over again. But actually, our bodies, our brains, even our psyches like a lot of that. They like a lot of predictability. So being able to have a life that feels consistent and predictable, that we know the rules for, that we can understand and make sense of, that's the second dimension. Coherence. Some researchers call it comprehension. This is like this cognitive need to get things understood well enough to keep going and not feel like the rules are always changing on you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the third one is purpose, which is kind of the popular kid of the meaning trio at this point. I think the reason is because purpose gets stuff done. I mean, purpose is your motivational component of meaning. It's really what are you on the planet to do, not who are you on the planet to be, for example. So purpose is really this overarching, really really long-term facing motivational structure of this high aspiration. What do you want to do with your life? That then we can use to organize the goals that we take on,
Yeah.
make our priorities lists, make difficult choices. If we have a sense of purpose, we can lean on those sorts of things in the present, but also the purpose makes the future come alive, right? I've sometimes talked about this as an anchor you throw into the future. Like it keeps you loosely tethered to something that doesn't even exist yet, but still is powerfully important to you. So those would be the three: significance, coherence, and purpose.
And it's really helpful. I think for me, the one that I find easiest to, in some ways, grasp is purpose. I suppose I'm definitely quite a purpose-oriented person, and perhaps there's hope as well in purpose, and that you're striving for that purpose. Coherence is a little bit more difficult, and I'm wondering, can you bring all three of these sort of elements of meaning to life, maybe by giving us an example of a real life person? And I did ask you before to have a think about this, but one example of somebody I've heard you talking about before is Nelson Mandela, obviously an incredible person, and I know somebody who you admired very, very much, as did I, and I'm so sure many of our listeners as well. But if you were to, obviously, you don't know what was in Nelson Mandela's head, but if you could sort of, to some degree, put yourself in his shoes, how might you see significance, coherence, and purpose playing a role in his life?
Yeah, I mean that's an amazing example, and I have to, of course, like you said, have the long distance view of the life of Nelson Mandela from this perspective. So, from the sense of significance, there's a beautiful little museum in his birth town of Kunu in South Africa, and it just tells the story of how he grew up. And he grew up the son of a chief, right, in an important head of a group of folks who had at that time like a pretty strong sense of who was really like that the leaders of that tribe were very important. And so Nelson Mandela grew up feeling important, probably felt irreplaceable in some way, as sometimes people who are lucky enough to be born in positions of power do. And so you'd think that like he had this sense of like self-worth, and it sounds a bit like he might have had a lot of fun with that for a while, like maybe enjoying a bit more of a hedonistic lifestyle than we think of, unless other than when we think about Nelson Mandela in his later years, one of the images that stands out the most is how much he loved to dance. I
Mm.
don't know if you've ever seen some of those videos of Nelson Mandela's life, and he through his whole life he just loved to have like a little bit of fun, right? And so you can imagine that it's a powerful, successful, important guy. He probably had a lot of fun when he was young. He was a little bit later to the freedom struggle than some other people were in South Africa, and of course I mean, you can argue that that was a several hundred year long struggle that continues to this day. But, so from Nelson Mandela, what's packed into the idea of significance, you can maybe even imagine having the same levels. Like I'm an important person, I'm lovable, it matters that I'm here, life is worth it. But the reasons why you come to understand why life is worth it could change. And that would be a function of coherence, right? So as he comes to understand the suffering, well, I'm not going to say he didn't understand it, but as he comes to see a potential role for himself in leading or being a part of this freedom struggle, the reason why he's an important person might shift. Like now he's someone who's fighting for a bigger picture issue for the millions of people who are being hurt and subjugated and degraded by the apartheid system in South Africa. So then his significance maps onto the way he understands the world, his niche, his role. You know, coherence does a lot of heavy lifting when it comes to just the psychology of being a person, right? Like identity falls into coherence, life story falls into coherence. All of your relationships, struggles and joys falls into coherence as you're trying to figure out how to interact and transact with another mind out there. So it does a lot of heavy lifting and it can help him understand like I've got something on my plate or in my destiny that is another reason why it's important that I'm here and I can't just like check out or to go back to partying, let's say. And then we get to purpose, right? And I think we think of purpose as, being really inspired by a powerful mission. And in this case, of course, Nelson Mandela was and signifies that to a lot of people. And one of the things that he said about purpose is he didn't say it about purpose, but he said it in general. It always seems impossible until it's done. And what the image I like to think of for Nelson Mandela saying that and thinking about purpose is his 22 years in prison on Robben Island, where he was really like imagine a purpose that exists even when you're in prison and the only people you interact with are the people who are oppressing you. Like essentially the people who've given you the reason to have a purpose because of the terrible things that they're doing. So he's not doing the purpose the same way that he was, right? So when you're in a community and you're rallying people for marches and for demonstrations and to try to get allies who have a little bit more power than you to push through legal changes that can be impactful, that's a purpose that feels like, yeah, we're doing something every day. I'm brothers and sisters in arms as we go forward. And then suddenly you're plopped into like a miserable solitary confinement prison cell on an island literally surrounded by sharks, right? Like right off the coast of Cape Town. It's like that's where those giant great white sharks jump out of the water. If you've ever seen those videos, that's like right, it's like just miles from where he was in prison, right? So purpose then has to be something that can survive then as well. So purpose for Nelson Mandela, being able to do nothing that he recognized, what he ended up doing in those decades of being imprisoned was still follow his purpose. His purpose still existed. It still animated what he did in his life. But he did it in a different way. So he befriended the prison guards, and one or two of them was instrumental in keeping his leadership and his inspiration flowing back and forth. So we can then see that purpose doesn't have to be something that has a huge achievement list. It's not like a shopping list. It's not like a smart goal. It really is like this huge destination you're trying to build a path towards a little bit at a time, and you're not exactly sure if you'll get there. So in Nelson Mandela's life, then we can see these interplays. And I'll just cap that off by saying I don't know I don't know which kind of person he was. Was he a significance first person? Was he like me, who's like I'm a coherence first person? Like I need things to make sense before I can do anything else, or is he like you, gravitating towards purpose and making things happen and driving towards goals? Um, we can be one of them, or we can be all of them, and they're all equally valid paths to meaning in life.
Well, that's helped me quite a bit. And also, this idea of, we don't need to be achieving goals every single day. I mean, there will be times in everybody's life, we'll have people listening who maybe have young families and, they are changing the world by raising, a beautiful next generation. That I guess the question I have for you, can purpose therefore change? So maybe at a point in time, maybe somebody's raising a young family and at that point actually that is their purpose. But perhaps when the family are grown up, their purpose changes or evolves again. Is that right? Or
As far as we can tell, I think that's right. Now, there's enough uncertainty in the data that people can pick different sides. Like this goes to the one even more basic question: can you have more than one purpose? I'm of the camp that says, yeah. When I talk to certain people, it's clear they've got really more than one really powerful thing going on. We can imagine someone who's really invested in raising their children and having a great family and having a great home. And at the same time, what they do with their work or what they do with their volunteering or what they do with their writing or their personal spiritual journey or their psychological healing, like that's an important purpose as well. And so a lot of people in my experience, I'm not convinced the data's out there yet, but my experience seemed to have more than one purpose. At least I felt like I also did, right? Like I had this life purpose, which my career kind of tucks inside of just trying to figure out what is it like to be human and how people tried to address that issue throughout history and around the world. Like that's kind of my purpose. Weirdly, it's a strange one, but that's what I do. But at the same time, trying to be a good dad and partner and all these other things is is vital as well. And, so conflicts among purpose sometimes can force changes in purpose themselves, I think, right? So if
Yeah.
I'm over investing in the trying to figure out what it means to be human side and under investing in the family side, then there's a cost. And in the case where you have two powerful purposes, there might always be a cost.
Yeah.
You might always be sensitive to what one path is costing in terms of progress on another path, or at least immersion in another path. And so I think that that's part that comes with the territory. And in terms of changing, I think it definitely does. It doesn't have to if you zoom out far enough, right? Like, my kids both are at university now, but I can tell you I'm not done being a parent. I can tell you with conviction, and if you want, I've got receipts to prove that I'm not done being a parent yet, right? So it all changes. I'm being a parent in a different way, but I don't want to, and I can't relinquish that sense of purpose about it. So I think there's a lot of flexibility. The one piece I'll say, as we've been kind of now throwing a lot of stuff at the listener in terms of concepts and even biographies and now multiple purposes, and maybe the purposes change as you go through life. There's if you want to develop in this area, even more so than um, I think even more so than getting good at writing out purpose statements or reading philosophy or reading spiritual texts. I think the ability to just introspect a little bit and be self-reflective with abstract, messy ideas is probably the meta skill for meaning, right? Whatever is going on in your life, if you can give yourself a little bit of time to step back and be like, why does everything feel so unhinged? Why does everything feel so alarming? Why do things feel empty? Why do things feel like smothering? Whatever it is,
Mm.
if you can just step back and let those questions percolate and kind of dive in to yourself a little bit, you'll have all the tools you'll need to navigate if your purpose needs to change, if your way of seeing the world is altering, but you're not quite putting words to it or concepts to it yet. So I would say, when in doubt, be comfortable being introspective. And then the other thing, this comes from Viktor Frankl's great work. If you're really in doubt, just go do good things. Don't think about it at all. Just go do good things and observe what happens.
And I have to say, I really like that point about just go and do good things. But let's go back to introspection, because that can actually be pretty overwhelming. And everything we've discussed, and you did give the example of Nelson Mandela, who's obviously a particularly unique and incredible person. Most of us are sort of ordinary human beings, and our wins through life are maybe quite a bit smaller. So this can feel quite an overwhelming topic. And we do know that over pondering on existential matters, could actually lead us potentially into depression. We know that as well. And so I wanted to put it out there and ask you, for the everyday person listening, what are the practical steps you would say if they're maybe feeling a bit lost and going, gosh, this is very high level, but actually, what is my meaning? Where do we start?
If people are already kind of struggling, like I'm not sure that you could make someone depressed by asking them to think about their life's meaning. You can make them annoyed. I know that because I've done that many times, right? And you can make them feel like there's a right answer out there that they're supposed to guess. Like, well, you know who won the Grammys in 1989, don't you? Like, and you're like, I guess I should know that. I have no idea, but right. So you can ask it in that way. But I would just say that as much as it's liberating and not scary, there's not anyone who knows what your purpose is supposed to be, right? There's no one who can tell you that you don't have enough of a purpose going on. And I would say, like, your point is perfect. Nelson Mandela is too much to use as a template. He's good to use as a inspiration. And this is another thing you run into is I'm just a regular person too, right? And I'm to try to read or talk about this sort of stuff, you're encountering incredible people and their life stories all the time. So it's really easy for me to feel like I'm doing a pretty weak job of what other people have done. but it's got to fit me. I mean, it's got to fit me. And it's got to fit each person who's listening. So if those questions are already kind of like sitting in our heads, um, then being able to feel okay with the question more than the answer is probably the first step, right? We're very much attracted in our contemporary, particularly Western culture to black and white thinking. You know, like one of the very first hypotheses I had was that people who search for meaning in their lives will be just the best people, right? But actually, what I found is they're anxious people and they're a little bit sad people, right? The people who are searching for meaning in life. But this is only really true in Western Europe and in North America, or at least US and Canada, right? When you go to places like countries and cultures like Korea, um, outside of Beijing, China, Japan, India, searching for meaning is that is the meaning. Like being in the questions is the answer, right? And that's most people in the world, if you think about who maps onto that profile of being not so black and white thinking, of being not everything has to be on my shoulders. That's most of the people who have ever lived and who are alive today. So it's only recently, and it's only in a few spots in the world where we think we have to tackle all this by ourselves and be right and never be wrong about the question that we thought we were right about in the first place. So, like, being okay with the question, if we can really do that, that's probably the easiest path forward. Like, just having it be a friendly little provocation instead of like a portentous tolling bell of you need to figure this shit out before you're dead sort of thing, right? So that's the first thing. So if people are already kind of stuck in their heads, being okay with not knowing and really like if it helps, listen to someone who studies this. That's the right path, probably. Being okay with not knowing because we don't really know. So then we can get a lot more specific after that. Probably the things that you like best and value best in your life already reflect at just a gut level what makes your life meaningful. Like, we tend to gravitate in to what's meaningful to other people, but we also gravitate towards the things that are meaningful for us. So one of the techniques that I like to ask people to do is um, it started out of just a place of curiosity, but it's now been replicated as a meaning in life intervention. And it's just take your phone, or if you're trendy now and have a digital camera again, take a picture, like maybe one a day of something that makes your life meaningful, or whatever your answer is in the moment you decide to do it to the question, what makes my life meaningful? Take a picture, let yourself do that for a week or so and make those favorite those in your album so you can find them later. And then sit down with somebody and share, or on Instagram or somewhere else, like what makes this a meaningful photo to me. Actually, I'm not good at this, but I launched. I'm not good at. I'm not good at following through on this sort of stuff, but I did put up a meaningful photos project on LinkedIn where people can post and sometimes others will comment and view. But my initial research showed that increased meaning in life for people and people's confidence and clarity, especially the part of sharing that with other people. And that's been replicated in using the same technique. It's been replicated using Instagram in other countries. So I think there's something there, right? Where if we get out of our own way and we think, okay, I don't have to read Aristotle to know how to live my life today, then you get a sense of what already in your life is meaningful, and then sharing that with someone, that's strangely enough, maybe even a little bit of an act of courage, right? To share things that are important to us. It's always kind of that's always been at the heart of what I wanted to do with with the career side of my life is to make talking about meaning in life just as like mundane and boring as talking about the weather or how Liverpool's doing or whatever it is, right? Like those we should be able to talk about this stuff, but we don't. And I know that podcasting and doing all the speaking and community engagement in this area that you do, you're probably also like just baffled. Why can't we just have more conversations every day about how we're doing, right? So having something like that, just a little photo, here's why this is meaningful to me. It, it, I've got, I'll stop talking about all the different dimensions that can be revealed to that little thing, but that's an important one. And then the last piece I'll say is again, hopefully super easy. And this is just think back over the last week. Stage one, just think back over the last week. Like, what are things that you did that you are kind of proud about? Just a little bit, like not not freed South Africa on your list, but like, I took a little extra time for X. I felt like doing Y, but instead I did Z, and Z was the better choice. Whatever, like nutrition or exercise oftentimes fits in there, or putting your phone down, right? Just try to like unpack why that event was something that you're a little bit more proud of than the other things that you do. And so then you can be a little bit of a detective and like, okay, these are things that are speaking to me, these photos, these choices I made. Why? What part of me are they calling to? And what part of me is like responding to what they're saying? It's already there.
And I have to say, I find this so helpful. And maybe it is sort of the purpose nature of me. I feel like I need goals. And now I've turned this into a goal in some ways. So I've, for a long time, found the idea of a gratitude journal helpful. But the truth is, I haven't stuck with it when I've written it down. So I'm more likely to stick with it when I say it verbally to my husband in the evenings. We just say, what are the three things we're grateful for? Now, I know many people who say they much prefer writing it down and then they can look back on it. But something like taking a photo of, those fleeting moments of life. And I've heard you talk, so I'm stealing a phrase from you here. I've heard you talk about those fleeting moments of life that in some ways give our life meaning. That seems like a really practical thing that not only can I get my head around, but actually it really doesn't take much time. We already spend too much time with our phones every day, if we're honest. We're probably adding very little time to just stop, take in whatever the moment is and take that photo. But I'm really interested because presumably you've seen the photos that people have taken when they've done this. What themes are emerging from what you've seen?
Mm. So I'm going to be very literalist about what your question was. What themes emerge from what I've seen? And there are no themes that emerge from what is in the photos themselves. This is so fascinating because I've seen everything from tennis shoes or trainers, I guess, for the across the pond folks, right? I've seen books. I've seen the inside of churches. I've seen parking lots. I've seen tractors. I've seen DJing equipment. I've seen um, just water, like not even identified necessarily as a place or a beach, or it's not a braggy Instagram thing, just a thing of water. You see dirty dishes, you see everything, and you would think it's just pure chaos. Like humans are a disaster if all these things are meaningful, right? So this is one reason why I think it's important to share these sorts of pictures with folks. Like you do one thing that can happen, I'm a terrible journaler as well. I wish I had records of all the times I said I should really be journaling. If I'd even just journaled on those days, I'd have like at least something interesting to look back on. But I've got nothing. I can't remember to do it. But one of the things that, unless you're good at it, comes out best in conversation is the context and the deeper importance and the threads with other things. Like, why were you grateful for that today? Well, it made me feel like I was actually seen that day. I was really kind of struggling. And when someone took the time to just notice me, that I was like, okay, I'm not just another customer today who's complaining about X, Y, and Z. This really was important. And then they stepped in and tried to help me even more. Like that made me feel hopeful about people. And, like corporations can't crush everyone's soul or whatever it is that like that's underneath there. So that can happen with meaning too. So I like to give an example of a picture um, of a man emptying a garbage can, and this was his job. He was a janitor. He was a cleaner, and even as it wasn't for an organization like NASA. There's a kind of hilariously titled paper putting a man on the moon, which was a deep dive into the sort of sense of calling, mission, and meaning that janitors at NASA had when they were doing the big moon launch, right? It wasn't that. It was just cleaning at a place where probably no one cared that much, about whether, like, nothing life or death was happening in the place that was being cleaned. But that person's story was that this was the first job that they had that didn't get them in trouble. You just think about that phrase. This is the first job I ever had that wouldn't get me in trouble. And that I feel like that's almost like Hemingway's five-word story, right? Baby shoes for sale, whatever it is. Like barely used. Six-word story, right? Like it's my first job that wouldn't get me in trouble. Like you just feel like such a sense of who that person is all of a sudden. And then he goes on to talk about how it makes his family proud. It helps him build a life for him and his family. And you're like, okay, that's more than a garbage can. That's more than someone wearing those little blue gloves to keep their hands safe from the garbage that we just throw everywhere. So that's kind of the beauty of it. Like that's when it really comes out, the themes. And then the themes are so often people,
Yeah.
right? I mean, this is like we can't get away from it. Chris Peterson said it best, of course, other people matter. And I know that Chris didn't mean they only matter for good. They matter because they hurt us too, right? They just impact us, other people. And so families, friends, um, some people are really connected to their sense of heritage, right? Like the people who fled in 1939 to come to America or something, or in the 1800s to come to a different country, or the people fleeing from America somewhere else, right? Like whatever it is, like sometimes we feel connected to people who we never knew, but made us who we are through the choices they made. And so there's a lot of depth to what people mean including all the struggles of trying to be in a long-term relationship and trying to be a good parent and especially trying to be a good child, let's say, right? All these sorts of things. So people come way high up there. One of the surprising things is just the stuff we elect to do every day, whether that's leisure, whether that's entertainment, whether that's our downtime, whether that's our exercise habits or our artistic expressions, like just the stuff we decide to do that fills our day, like that ends up showing up when you ask people to take pictures. But if you ask them, like, what makes your life meaningful? They're never like, oh, watching baking shows on TV while I eat mac and cheese or something like that. That doesn't show up, but like that'll get a picture because that ends up providing structure and like connective tissue for our lives. So I think that's another thing. Hopefully some of these examples for the people who are viewing and listening this are realizing like, yeah, pictures of tennis shoes, pictures of mac and cheese, pictures of TV, all these sorts of things. Whatever adds richness to our lives can make it meaningful.
Yeah.
It can be a little trickier to figure out how does my purpose show up every day. But if you just ask yourself that question, is there anything I can do today that aligns with my purpose? Maybe even for a goal-driven person like you, that can be helpful, right? Just is what am I doing something today, or am I anticipating or looking forward to doing something today that aligns with my purpose, nudges me a little bit further down the path? That's a really good thing, and you can check that off, even though you can't really probably check your whole purpose off.
Yeah, fair enough. And yeah, I like the practical aspect to this. You mentioned that academic paper, which I've read as well, and is also one of my favourites because it's so well written. But this idea of this wonderful person, this janitor in NASA, and his job is to send people to the moon. And so he's got that real sense of purpose, which brings us a little bit from our personal lives to our work lives. Because how do we find that sense of purpose from the work that we do? Or perhaps what are the barriers to finding that sense of purpose from the work that we do?
These are really huge questions, and I think they're looming larger than ever right now in the world. One of the I mentioned that I really had two goals in my career. And my career for me fits into life, right? So it's not a separate thing for me. I don't really have well articulated career goals anymore. Like my career was a way for me to do what I thought my life was supposed to do. Um, for better, for worse. I don't know that I'd recommend that to other people, but it works for me. And so, but I had two. One was I wanted by the end of my career for people to be able to talk about meaning just as easily as they talk about the weather. I don't think that'll ever happen. I just think there's something in human nature and culture that we don't talk about good things with as much savor, relish, and frequency as we talk about trivial bad things. Feel like we talk about trivial bad things a lot, like how irritating this celebrity is, or whatever the referee's decision in that match, or we just talk about we complain about those sorts of things more than we reveal vulnerability around what really makes our lives wonderful. And maybe that won't change, But the second thing I had was I wanted meaning and meaningful work by extension to be respectful areas. They kind of were laughed off when I was getting started. There was very little research. People didn't think I was serious, or they'd be dismissive of it, of the idea. They'd just say meaning is just, oh, that's just happiness by another name, for example. Or someone said it would be career. I'll never have a career if I study it. I was like, "Oh, okay, I don't care if I have a career though, so I'm going to keep doing it." Right. So like all those sorts of things. And I think that's happened. And in the world of meaningful work, then that's caused a real problem because the people who are getting a lot of who are putting a lot of energy now towards meaning and corporate purpose are organizations that are not going to do it right, in my opinion. Like the global consultancies that are coming out and they all have meaning and purpose programs now. Those are not real meaning and purpose programs for the most part, as far as I can see. The ones I've seen and the parts of them that I've seen and the people in consultancies that I've talked to who have had a chance to try to implement those. I mean, it's the same recycled stuff with some, that's not their skill set. Like we can't point to people whose profession is to increase productivity and efficiency and profitability to find out how we're supposed to live our lives. That's not what they're trained to do. So we've got a real big problem looming right now for meaningful work because I think we're just as likely to break the concept like we broke engagement and like we broke job satisfaction by just throwing it into the workplace in such a terrible way that workers cringe when they hear. They're like, they wince, like, we're going to do an engagement activity now. Oh, no, not again. Don't hurt me. Right. It could very well go that, yeah, we're doing meaningful work now. People are like, oh, God, I can't take any more. Right. Because it's a phony stuff turns people cynical. Cynicism is the poison to meaning. So I'm worried about that. So the major barrier is the fact that it's really easy to co-opt words
Yeah.
and ruin the beauty behind them. So I think we're getting close to that. People who are in positions of power want to squeeze more out of their workers, and meaning and purpose is being held up now as a way to do that. And that's too bad because meaningful work is a way to get more out of people. But we should be really careful with that, not exploitative with that.
It's interesting what you're saying because in some ways, if an organization starts saying, this is why our work is meaningful, in some ways, they're putting the words in. One of the things I've seen in my own research into how to improve employee well-being is number one, we all have strengths. As we get older, we start to know what our strengths are and we should lean into our strengths. So I guess that's one thing. Another is the importance of autonomy and empowerment. So empowering our colleagues to, have a say in what their role looks like, what they're focusing on, what their objectives are. We talk about task crafting, things like this. Do you feel that these elements, empowerment, autonomy, working to your strengths, help overcome that obstacle a little bit?
I think they do. So, but I think they're part of a weird habit we have now of continually putting more and more and more and more responsibility for getting through life on individuals to figure out on their own. We do this all over the place, I think. We're doing this with, well, in the US, for example, we do that with retirement and with being able to stay healthy. Like, that's all on you. If you want to avoid eating cat food and you want to live to the age 37, you better be smart with money. That's just part of it, kind of. So, and now if you want to have a meaningful job or you want to be treated like a human at work, you better be smart about who you work for, be prepared to sacrifice, better pay at a more successful, bigger company for worse pay in a different kind of position. And then also now we've got a playbook of skills you have to learn and implement every day in order to get through. And I know that my advice is I'm not pointing the finger at anybody as much as I'm pointing the finger at myself as well. Like most of my research on meaningful work has been focused on what people say about it and what they can do about it, right? So, but this idea, I just want to say, like it probably works. I just wonder when the breaking point is, right? So
Mm.
we can say to people, yeah, here's some things that you should do. I cobbled together an acronym called SPIRE, that captured what the research had. And strengths was the first, strength is the S, right? Like use your strengths, like figure them out and then use them at work. That's probably statistically the number one correlate of meaningful work. If you get to use your strengths at work, that's the best predictor of whether you're going to find that work meaningful. Personalization got more to our values. Like, don't try to do things that are toxic to your values because that's going to hurt over the long term. The I was integration, right? So try to figure out how work fits most healthily with other parts that are important to you of your life. R was resonance. If your company has a mission and it wasn't just randomly generated by a consulting firm, but they actually care, try to find parts of that resonate with you that you can draw strength from. And then E was expansion. And I know very well that you care and resonate with this because that's trying to do more. That's trying to do more for more people. Try to have some benefit to the greater good in what you do with work. So the research is pretty clear. And then, when we think about something like job crafting, that can fit with strengths or that can fit with personalization. When we think about um, learning more about what people are doing at the organization, the founder's story or their corporate purpose, that can fit with our resonance. When we some types of job crafting, like Marty's suggestion to use your strengths to do something in the service of something greater than yourself. Marty Seligman said that in, I think, his first book. And that Authentic Happiness was his first book, and he argued that if we use our strength in the service of something bigger than ourselves, that's meaning. I mean, that isn't meaning in the field, but that's what Marty said about it, and that seems to work under expansion in meaningful work. There's a long list of advantages towards having your employees have meaningful work. They don't leave as much, so you don't spend as much on replacement. You can attract better talent. They work for free a lot of times, like they work overtime. They're the ones who put the paper back in the printer when they run it dry, like all these sorts of things. There's a big long list.
But let's
I'll
not
just
encourage working overtime for free.
no. So that's the thing, right?
But
So how do
yeah,
we make that argument? We're like,
yeah,
yeah, so meaningful work is good for your business, it's good for your bottom line,
yeah.
but don't make them work for free.
Yeah. I want to finish up by asking you just 3 or 4 quick questions about you. So,
Mhm.
first of all, what do you do daily to look after your own well-being?
Oh, what do I do daily to look after my own well-being? I would say one or two things. One is I used to be a runner, but my knee's no good anymore, so I make sure I go for long walks. And two is, especially ever since COVID, I decided I was going to do what I used to love, which is read harder books. You know, like like what used to be regular books to people 100 years ago now are like difficult classics to modern minds like myself. So I'm trying to make sure I'm reading through some of the real literature sorts of books and always have one of those going, always have a nonfiction book going, and then when I need it, have a funner version of fiction or nonfiction going as well. So I'd say reading and walking. That sounds super boring, doesn't it? I read and I walk
I think
to
it
take care of
sounds
myself.
wonderful.
That's me.
I think it sounds wonderful. So, do you take meaningful photos? If you do, what are the past, say, 3 or 4 photos you've taken?
I do take meaningful photos for sure. A lot of the photos I will take um, function as have two functions. Number one is an aesthetic function. So among strengths, appreciation, beauty and excellence is my highest. So frost on a leaf, the way the clouds look, all those sorts of things. I'll take little pictures of those. And sometimes those are enough. Like, especially if I'm on all these walks, I'll stop and I'll appreciate it. It's pretty dingy right now, with all of the vegetation dead, but you can always find something. And so that orientation keeps me looking for beauty and goodness in the world also. So I've got strong attraction to cynicism. you know, so uh so that's one function of that. But the other thing is I just use them as invitations to remember good times.
Yeah.
So I love like a little photo of um a little plant growing in an old wall, if I know that that's from Rome or if that's from Saint-Emilion, or that's even from just down the street, then that reminds me of that day or that trip or that experience. And so then I engage in nostalgia. And both savoring and nostalgia are good well-being interventions that folks can try, especially, I think, uh, if you partner that with gratitude. That's really good for people who trend towards cynicism and despair, for example. So that threesome works pretty well. So that's how I do it with meaningful photos.
Awesome. I mean, I sort of want you to create a new social media platform simply called Meaningful Photos. And we're not allowed any negativity, we're not allowed any cynicism, and we're certainly not allowed trolling on the Meaningful
Uh,
Photos social media. But final question: if you could time travel and you could go back and give advice to your 18 or 21-year-old self, what would that advice be?
that advice would definitely have been take more advantage of all the opportunities you had in college. Like I used my college years to go from really, really good altar boy to problematic person in a short period of time and then try to claw my way out of it. So I was really in my own head from 18 to 20 something. I mean, I wasn't a terrible person, but I was really very, very self-focused, and I didn't challenge myself to be broader of a thinker back then in terms of like how am I impacting other people? You know, what can I do? Like, there's so many advantages and opportunities when you're young like that. That I mean, there's still opportunities when now that I'm old, but like I had access to professors and other students and student clubs and all these free libraries. I guess I still do as a professor. Have all those, I guess. But like at that time, um, all a lot of my best memories were taking classes that I didn't know what I was going to do with. That fits me as a person. Like I'm a little bit like a magpie, a little bit here, a little bit there. I collect it and somehow it turns into something in my mind. But I do think that I had a chance to have I just had more opportunities I could have done. Uh, I think I'd done more positive and maybe gotten out of my little bad behavior funk a little faster if I'd been focusing less on how miserable I felt inside and more on all the really kind of cool things that were around me on the outside.
It does occur to me that you might be being a little bit harsh to young Michael because being young is challenging, and part of it is just figuring out who you are. And maybe that's okay for a young person to be doing all of these things to figure out who they are. But we had on a previous episode of this podcast, we had Dan Butner, who you probably know from Blue Zones, who's teaching all of us how to lead, long lives, live beyond the age of 100. So in that context, you're still actually remarkably young. So I'd like you to hop back in your time machine and tell me on your 100th birthday, what's the change that you want to see in the world?
Yeah. Well, for one, I don't think I'll make it because tall people don't live as long as average height people. So that's bad news. But we've been around as cultural creatures for 6,000 years, give or take. And if you think about what culture is, at least one of the things that culture is, it's a playbook for how you're supposed to make it through the world. And with that much time to practice, and let's say that I've got, still some decades left. After 6,000 years, are we going to see that much change in the next couple decades before I'm gone? I don't know, but the question is really remarkable, right? Like we have lessons. If you go back sometimes and read like, what was the best advice from 300 BC around the world, which is something I did recently for my book. I was like, what was the advice about what you're supposed to do with your life that was around in 300 BC? That's just because Aristotle is like this benchmark for a lot of folks, the Greeks. It was amazing advice. If we followed it, we'd be in great shape.
So what's
But we
the
don't, right?
advice?
Oh, there's tons of it though. Like that's the
Okay.
thing. It's not just one thing. It's like there's a really long list. It's like it's not even stuff that's stuff that we say today. Like like from Taoism, for example, which was around. Like you don't have to try to force changes. You can try to follow what's natural and make small movements now. This is maybe the one big change. It's old, old knowledge, and it's been said a million different ways, a million different times. But from Taoism, since you sparked that in me, right? Like you try to make the little changes now that become the big difference in the future.
Yeah.
And humans are pretty bad at that.
Yeah.
Even though we've known, like I said, for over 2,000 years, that that's an important thing to do. So a lot of the problems we're facing right now, and I'm very, very sort of horrified by the ecological problems we face. I mean, I knew about all the advice that we're giving people now about what they're supposed to do with their lives. I had heard from other people decades ago,
Mm.
10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, right? Like, why can't we do these things? We know that we're going down a morally bankrupt path with the way that we run our companies,
Mm.
the way that we reward certain people in societies with wealth and take it away from other people. We know that causes bad problems down the road. Why can't we get a little bit better at making the small changes now that lead to big differences in the future? When we do that, we make small bad changes now that lead to catastrophes in the future. So what is so hard about switching that? That's what I'd like to see coming up. Can we get better at making the small good changes that make huge positive differences in the future and better at stopping doing the little stuff that adds up to calamity in the future?
Yeah. So small positive changes to lead to good in the world. Michael, I have so enjoyed this conversation. It has certainly made me think, and I'm sure it has made many of our listeners think as well. Thank you so much, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you in person soon.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation as well. And thanks for having me on the podcast.